Okay, I'm recording this now, so anything you say will be on the record. Okay, so the new government is going to be launched. Yes, Paul.
Matt was raising his hand, I think, but
I'm sorry.
it was caught in the light.
I see. Okay, so thank you, Paul. Matt.
So I was going to say, now that we have a new constitution that's been ratified, now it's actually time to put the government in place, and elections and whatnot need to start happening.
That very, very good. Yes, and so that is actually what happens in late 1788 as the Constitution is going to take effect. Rhode Island and North Carolina are not part of this, but the other states do have elections for Congress, and the state legislatures meet to choose members of the Senate. And there aren't real surprises. Well, there always are surprises in elections. I think one was that in Boston, Samuel Adams is defeated for a seat in the federal Congress by Fisher Ames. Ames was a young, Adams was old at this time. He was born in 1722. So do the math. How old would he be in 1788? How old would he be in 1788? Yes, Giovanni?
66.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to have to stop saying he was pretty old. Fisher Ames, though, was in his 30s, which is young, at least by my standards. It might be old by your standards, but much younger than 66. Ames, strong supporter of the Constitution. Adams, you'll recall, had not been. Virginia, one of the surprises perhaps was that the Virginia legislature did not choose James Madison to be one of their senators. The reason being Patrick Henry really controlled the legislature, and he was not going to give Madison a seat in the Senate. Instead, the two Virginia senators, both were opponents of ratifying the Constitution. One of them was George Mason. But for the most part, most of the people elected were supporters of ratifying the Constitution, with, a couple of minor exceptions. And the states also chose presidential electors. And as I think I mentioned, the electors all voted for George Washington. Now, the Congress convenes in New York in March of 1789. And the House of Representatives is where most of the action takes place. James Madison was elected to the House of Representatives. He defeated James Monroe for a seat in Congress. Monroe had been an opponent of ratification at the Virginia Convention. So now, just as he had really undertaken to drive things at the convention in Philadelphia and had then been one of the real leaders in getting the thing ratified, Madison becomes one of the real leaders in the House of Representatives. And the first things it does is do what Matt was suggesting, creating a federal government. That is, they have to create the executive offices as well as, of course, a judiciary. The Constitution was vague about what that would include. So executive departments, they create a Secretary of State or a Department of State to handle foreign. By the way, under the Confederation, there already were some executive ministers. There was a Minister of Foreign Affairs, and that position was held by John Jay. There was a Minister of Finance, and that position had been held by Robert Morris until he gave up and realized the problem was hopeless. And there was a Minister of War, and the Minister of War, anyone know who the Minister of War was? Yes, Matt.
I think this is wrong, but I'm going to guess Henry Knox.
That was right. It is Henry Knox. Okay. So I actually have a prize for the, should I have announced there was a prize for the correct answer? Would you have guessed if you knew there was something at stake? You can come to my office and pick up a copy of Travels with George about George Washington's journeys as president. Okay, so Henry Knox, Minister of War. So the Congress then knows we need someone to handle foreign affairs, we need someone to handle the Treasury, and we need someone to handle war. And so they create those executive departments. Now, secretaries instead of ministers. And these are not, they also create the office of attorney general, realizing that there's going to be some legal work involved in this new government. So there should be an attorney general to handle that. And then, of course, Washington arrives at the end of April of 1789 and is inaugurated as president, and then begins the work of appointing people to these positions. The first Secretary of State, anyone know? They do have to come up with prizes for these things too. Yes, Trevor.
Madison.
No, good guess though. Yes, Paul.
Is it John Jay?
No, he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but he's not going to be the Secretary of State. Yes, Haley.
Is it Jefferson?
It is Jefferson. Thank you. So Thomas Jefferson. Jovan, what were you going to say, Jefferson too, or you had another guess? That would be awkward to say, yeah, I was going to guess something else that would have been wrong. So yeah, the thing is though, Jefferson is the minister to France, and he doesn't really want to be Secretary of State. He arrives home actually in early 1790 and learns that President Washington has appointed him to be Secretary of State, and it takes him a while to decide if he wants to take it. Tricia guesses John Adams. John Adams is actually vice president. We'll get to him in a minute. Thanks, Tricia. So Jefferson is going to be appointed Secretary of State, but he doesn't know it yet, and B, he doesn't know if he will accept it yet. So meanwhile, John Jay continues acting as Secretary of State. So I don't know, Paul, maybe I should give you partial credit for saying John Jay, since he continues doing that particular job. Then Secretary of the Treasury, this should be an easy one. There's a whole musical about him. Yes, thank you, Alexander Hamilton. And Secretary of War is Henry Knox. Okay, still Henry Knox. Attorney General is actually a part-time position, and President Washington appoints Edmund Randolph of Virginia. And he tells Randolph it's a part-time job, which means you can continue practicing law. And in fact, being Attorney General would probably help your law practice. It's a real selling point to become Attorney General, because it's not going to require that much work. So this all happens as Washington is appointing these worthy people, and the House of Representatives also passes a Judiciary Act, which creates a Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will have 5 members, and the Chief Justice will be, anyone know, Chief Justice, first Chief Justice? Yes, Jovan.
Is it John Jay?
It is, in fact, John Jay, who is also acting as Minister of War. Okay, so this is the real action is happening in the House of Representatives, which is doing these things. Now, this leaves the Senate with time on its hands. And who is the presiding officer of the Senate? Yes, Matt.
The vice president, so John Adams.
President. So John Adams, presiding officer of the Senate. Now, President Washington had listened very carefully to the arguments about the Constitution, and he knew that there was some hesitation about having an office that combined executive and legislative powers. And that office, of course, was the vice president. So he didn't think he should consult with the vice president about things. And so John Adams is also left with time on his hands, and the Senate preoccupies itself with a couple of very important questions. One is, how much are we going to be paid? This, you may think that's a silly thing to worry about, but if you work for a living, you would really want to know how much you're going to be paid. And so the senators do really spend a lot of time worrying about that. Another thing is this. Well, we'll get to this in a minute, because here is the problem. President Washington appointed these various people to be the executive officers. And so he knew, okay, whoever is responsible for foreign affairs will be responsible for foreign affairs. Whoever is responsible for the Treasury will be responsible for that. And the Constitution says I can call on them for their opinions in writing. The Congress, by the way, also says the Secretary of the Treasury has to respond to Congress in writing. That is, they want a direct connection with the Treasury. And of course, the House of Representatives votes for money bills. So they see their role as much more closely tied to the Treasury than the president's is. The president, chief executive officer, and so he's supposed to oversee the whole thing, but not be involved in, kind of nitty gritty things. So anyway, where were we going with this? So Washington is a little perplexed about one thing in the Constitution, which is, okay, specific case. One of the big things they have to do is negotiate a new treaty with the Cherokee Indians. So Washington and Knox draft a treaty. According to the Constitution, by the way, according to the Constitution, who ratifies treaties? Yes, Giovanni.
Congress. I think the Senate does.
It says the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. So when Washington looks at the Constitution, he sees the phrase advise and consent in the Senate and the executive. So Washington takes from this that when he wants advice and consent, he should go to the Senate. So Washington and Knox have drafted a treaty with the Cherokee Indians, and then Washington and Knox go into the Senate, and Washington stands at the podium and he says, gentlemen, Secretary Knox has drafted a treaty which we propose to negotiate with the Cherokee Indians. Here is Article 1, and he reads Article 1 to the senators and says, do you advise and consent? And there's a similar reaction I am getting right now. That is an awkward silence. And so then Washington thinks maybe they want me to read the whole thing. So here's Article 2. He reads and then says, do you advise and consent? Well, should the Senate advise and consent to, by the way, Washington in person is a much more intimidating presence than I am here on Zoom. He had been a commander for 8 years of the Continental Army, and he's very tall and very imposing, and he's not used to having people challenge him. And here he is asking these senators who have been sitting around wondering how much they're going to be paid if they advise and consent. And finally, one of the senators says, well, Mr. President, you should put this in writing to us. We haven't had time to consider this, and we'll get back to you on it. Now, Washington wonders why he should go negotiate a treaty if the Senate's not going to advise and consent to it. The senators wonder, if we tell Washington, yeah, we like that, and then it gets changed, are we still bound to it? Or we may think about it a little more and know, well, we didn't really think it through when you were standing there saying, do you advise and consent? You can see that could be a little more frightening. And so they say, well, we'll get back to you on it if you put it in writing. And Washington is furious. He throws the papers down on the floor and says, this defeats every intention, every purpose I had in coming here. I am never going to come consult with you again. And he storms out. So the Senate is not going to advise and consent with Washington. So, the senators do have a point. If they come and commit themselves, they're kind of stuck. And so it does leave Washington not sure who should advise and consent with him. So he thinks, okay, John Jay is someone who knows a lot. And of course, he's Minister for Foreign Affairs, still acting as Secretary of State, also Chief Justice. And the Supreme Court really doesn't have anything to do right now. And Jay would be, if I had John Jay available, I'd certainly want to consult with him. So Washington has some questions about things coming before the federal government, and he wants Jay's opinion on them. So Washington goes to call on now Chief Justice Jay and acting Secretary of State Jay. and Washington has his questions for Jay. And Jay, by the way, is someone Washington has to treat with more respect than the senators. And Jay stops Washington and says, as Chief Justice, I really cannot tell you in advance what a position might be, because whatever you're talking about might come before the court as a matter of law. And in that case, whatever I say now might it might preclude the judgment of the court. So I really can't give an advisory opinion on anything, which is what Washington wanted. If we did this, would it be a good idea? Jay doesn't want to say, yeah, that would be a good idea, and then have it turn out to be a bad idea on reflection. So Jay tells him, no, you really cannot consult with me or the other justices of the court about things that might come before the government, because they might come before the court. This, by the way, establishes a very important precedent that the members of the court don't give advisory opinions to the president or anyone else. They wait until something comes before the court as a matter of law. And Washington can't really lose his temper with John Jay the way he can with the senators. And I think if you have dealings with senators, your patience will probably wear thin as well. So the Senate is kind of left with time on its hands to worry about how much they're going to be paid, as well as something else that is really very important. And this is something in which John Adams plays a role, because the Constitution also requires the president from time to time to give the Congress an account of the state of the Union. And so Washington does have the heads of the executive departments to prepare for him whatever it is they think he should inform Congress of. So Hamilton tells him about the state of the Treasury, which is pretty bleak. We'll get to that in a bit. You know, Jay, in his capacity as acting Secretary of State, about American relations with the rest of the world, Knox about the Indians, as well as the state of the Army. And then Washington goes to the Congress to read this annual message. And by the way, the Constitution says it is a report on the state of the Union. The presidents call it the annual message. And it remains the annual message into the 20th century when we change the wording back to State of the Union. And so as Washington is preparing to come to the Congress to inform them of the state of the Union, there's actually a pretty big debate in the Congress about what exactly will happen when President Washington comes in to inform us of the state of the Union. Will we, what, is he just going to walk in and come up to the podium? Will he be introduced first? And if he's introduced, should he have a chair to sit in while he's waiting? And if there is a chair, should it just be, hey, we'll pull up a chair for you, or should it be a special chair? And of course, in Parliament, everyone addresses the chair. And in fact, the sessions of Parliament are opened with the monarch coming and reading an account of what the monarch thinks Parliament should be doing. So some members of the Congress, and in fact, Vice President Adams, remember, who had just returned from his duties as the American minister to the Court of St. James, thinks that, yes, there should be a chair for the president, and it should always be there, a special chair, and we can address it the way they do in Parliament. And maybe we should have a canopy over the president's chair to signify, you know, you don't want just anybody sitting in the president's chair. It's a special chair just for the president. What do you think of this idea? Special chair for the president? Matt's shaking his head, not anticipating he may one day be president and want that special chair. Yes, Jovan.
I think giving the president a chair is fine, but they probably shouldn't put all the pomp and circumstance around it, especially if they're trying to separate themselves from Parliament and the king. I feel like the closer you make the president like the king, the more connotatively you're giving him, or implicitly you're giving him. And I feel like that would kind of go against the purpose of the Constitution.
Okay, well, The chief advocate for this, it turns out, is John Adams. And Adams didn't want the president to be like a king, but he did want people to respect the office and to respect this new government, recognizing that you have all of these new offices and people don't have any real attachment to them. So Adams is really adamant that we do need to establish that the president's not just an ordinary guy. He is, in fact, a holder of an office. And so Adams also spends time arguing that, well, it's an important thing. When he walks in, even if he doesn't have a special chair, how will we announce him? You know, say, here's the president. Here's, here's Washington, and he has some things to say. And Adams has another idea here. Remember, he had been the American minister to the court of St. James, and ambassadors who present their credentials tell whoever they're presenting them to, the head of state, whatever country, who had sent them. And usually it's a pretty elaborate title. So, for example, an ambassador from Great Britain would say, I am sent by George, King, by grace of God, of England, Ireland, Scotland, France, Wales, King, Defender of the Faith, which was actually a title given to the monarch by the Pope, and so on. So this really signifies that George Rex, George III, isn't just some guy who is sent an ambassador. He is a plenipotentiary, that is, someone with power. The King of France would say, sent by Louis. His most Catholic, his most Christian Majesty and King of France, Brittany, England. That is, the King of England claims to be King of France. The King of France claims to be King of England. And the Queen of Portugal is Her Most Faithful Majesty, along with other things. When I was young, there was an emperor of Ethiopia into the 20th century, Haile Selassie, and part of his title was the Conquering Lion of Judah. This is a pretty significant thing. And so you have these ambassadors presenting their credentials, which are really quite magnificent to hear. And then you have someone else saying, I am sent by the President of the United States. Well, Adams says he'll be laughed out of Europe. Every cricket company, every fire company has a president. What distinguishes the President of the United States from, say, the President of Suffolk Student Government Association? So Adams thinks there should be a title for the president that suggests the dignity and majesty of the office, which we hope it will have, as well as the fact that it's an elective office. That's the distinguishing thing. So Adams's idea for the title for the president, which will really show those European powers how things work, is George Washington, his elective mightiness, George Washington, President of the United States and defender of their liberties. So he's a mightiness, but he's an elective mightiness. And he is the President of the United States and the defender of their liberties. That's why we've elected him. So I think this sounds pretty good. And by the way, Adams, as a vice president, recognizes that he's partially an elective mightiness. And to show that even though he's a presiding officer in a legislative body, he's an executive officer, he wears a ceremonial sword to his duties as vice president, the sword being the symbol of executive power. And he also has a coat of arms put on his carriage as a way of distinguishing the Adams carriage, the vice presidential carriage, from any other carriage you might see in New York. I think this makes a great deal of sense. And Adams says that, of course, much of this is theater. And much of this, he says, might be absurd to philosophers, but any government is absurd to philosophers. So what do you think? His elective mightiness, President of the United States, defender of their liberties? Or do you want something more? I think, conquering lion of Judah sounds pretty good, I think. What? Yes, Jovan.
I think giving the president a title is fine. It's really fine, I guess. I don't really have a particular problem with it. You have to, I guess, appear respectable before Europe. It's kind of something you just have to deal with.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if it should necessarily be his elective mightiness, but nothing's really springing to mind at the moment.
Okay, yeah. See, okay, yeah. Paul, do you have a thought on this? Better title?
Yeah, so I disagree. I think titles are first of all, I think they're kind of stupid. Because like I don't know if anybody else has seen, but like the Kim Jong-un titles for his like superior godliness or ridiculous stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think they're ridiculous.
Well, Kim Jong-un doesn't think they're ridiculous.
I understand why Adams wants it, but I think like playing into the European like title lordship aristocracy is kind of like defeating the purpose, as Giovanni earlier said, of like the American, we're not about that. We're something new. We're something potentially better than that.
Okay. Matt, do you have a thought on this, titles?
So I concur with what has been said by Jovan and Paul. And I really like John Adams, but like he doesn't do himself any favors at all. Like I understand that you want the presidency and by extension the vice presidency to have a certain gravitas and command some sort of respect.
Yeah.
But I think in the environment of post-revolutionary America, just adding however theatrical titles of nobility don't really endear you to the Republican values that you're supposed to be standing for.
Okay. Yes, Anthony.
Would the president be introduced this way everywhere, or would it just be internationally? Like,
yeah. He's not going anywhere. So when he comes into the Congress to present his annual message, his elective mightiness, George Washington, President of the United States and defender of their liberties.
Yeah, I don't like that for like anything domestic. If it's like foreign, sure. Like, you want to like parlay with them and you want to do it the way they do so you can look strong and, look like you have self-respect, sure. But yeah.
Okay. By the way, does anyone know how they resolve this? What the president's title is? Should you ever meet him? Yes, Matt.
At least domestically and for most formal occasions, it's just Mr. President.
Yes. Yeah, it is the president of the United States. I mean, the whole thing does, as one of you said, doesn't do John Adams any favors. He comes off looking ridiculous. Washington doesn't say anything about this. He's leaving this to Congress to work out. And people start mocking poor John Adams and saying that the vice president should be called his rotundity. And also that what Adams is aspiring, that Adams spent too much time in London and he wants to be the Duke of Braintree. And which is really unfair to poor John Adams, but he does bring it on himself with his kind of thoughtful, let's come up with a title for the president. Now, meanwhile, the president does come and present his annual message. As I said, he has the members of the executive departments draft things, and then still trying to find people with whom he can advise and consent. He turns to James Madison, and Madison takes all of these things that Jay and Hamilton and Knox have presented and turns them into an annual message. Really, Washington he believed he wasn't very good as a writer. So he was very good at finding people who could convey what he was saying in a good way. So Madison drafts Washington's message. Now, what happens then is each house separates and they discuss the message, and then they have a committee go back to tell the president what they thought of the message. And for the House of Representatives, it's a fairly straightforward thing. They have, who do you think the House would ask to draft their response to Washington's message? All 40 or whatever, 100, however many representatives there aren't going to sit around drafting this. They have to have someone who can put together their response. Okay, we liked points A, B, and C, and we will take these under consideration. Um, okay, so in a course on the framing of the Constitution, yes, Paul.
So I'm assuming the House of Representatives has Madison draft
Yes,
the response.
yes.
So Madison drafts the message.
Madison
and then
drafts the response to the
response.
message. And then, of course, Washington has to respond to the House's response. And who do you think he has draft his response to the House's response? It is, again, James Madison. Okay, so Madison wrote the message, Madison wrote the response, Madison wrote the response to the response. The Senate, unfortunately, does not have Madison. They have to draft their own message, and they hit a stumbling block with the first line. How should they begin this? You have any thoughts? Nice speech. Thanks for coming. Their thinking is you simply say, thank you for your speech. Sounds kind of perfunctory. So they want to say, Mr. President, your most gracious speech with which you benefited us. What do you think of the phrase most gracious speech? May not be a phrase you use in everyday life, but it actually does have a history. Would anyone object to calling Washington's speech most gracious? Yes, Jovan, you would or wouldn't? You think, yes, that's exactly the phrase I was looking for?
Yeah, I would object to calling it gracious. He got pretty upset at the end, and he didn't really seem to care about what they wanted. He just
Well, this was his first annual message. It's not when he started. That wasn't the one where he came storming out of the Senate. This is an annual message, which is different to both houses of Congress. Similar, they are thinking to when the monarch opens a session of the parliament. He is telling them what they might be thinking about doing and what the state of the union is so they can attend to it. Though similar to the way the monarch and they're thinking, this is kind of modeled on what the monarch does, comes and opens a session of parliament, directing our attention to certain things. So it's the word gracious. Yeah, I agree. Throwing down the papers and storming out isn't gracious at all. But I don't think they respond to that. They don't say your most sullen behavior, the temper tantrum you threw is not something good. Yes, Matt.
I don't think gracious should be used at all, but also I don't think they should be extensively like thanking him for this, like the speech itself. Like it's his job to come before Congress and to provide the State of the Union.
Yeah, so
I guess it's kind of it'd be weird, and if I was the president, I'd be upset if I got a response saying, thank you for graciously coming and doing your job. But I think it just needs to be addressed differently.
Okay, Trevor, you have a thought on this?
I feel like it's somewhat appropriate for the State of the Union. Doesn't the speaker invite the president to speak?
Yeah, it does.
If you invite someone, then it'd be nice to thank them for coming.
Well, yeah, that's very true. And not just say, okay, you did your job. And, the speaker, by the way, it's a recent custom where the speaker sits behind the president, tearing up the speech as he reads it. But that's, they don't use the word gracious because that is what the monarch's speech is called. And they're trying to distance themselves from that idea. But all this shows really an attempt to establish some kind of a tone here that will make people respect this government. And so one thing Washington does as a way of helping to establish this is, people are constantly going to be coming in trying to get things from the president. And so he wants to control somewhat his own time. So he will have every Wednesday afternoon at 3 a levee where he and all members of the cabinet will be available at the house where the president is living in New York, and they will all stand at certain places. Someone will mark with chalk on the carpet where each one should stand. And there will be a table with tea on one side of the room. So you come in and you shake hands with each member of the official family and you drink tea. And if you have any business to discuss, you can, and then you leave. Now, Mrs. Washington has a similar levy for the ladies of the wives of the cabinet officers, and then the wives of members of Congress and of diplomats and so on. And this is a way of sparing the president from being constantly having people coming in saying, hey, can you give my nephew a job with whatever federal agency? So it's a way of controlling time, also trying to establish a tone here. So, and Washington also won't stay in a private home while he's president. He is trying in a way differently from what Adams is proposing. You know, George Washington really didn't need a title to make people see that he was different. He was better than the rest of us. But he's also wary of the idea of titles, as others are. And he finds the whole thing kind of embarrassing that the Congress is debating what to call the president. Though for Adams, this is a very serious thing. Okay, now for James Madison, once the Congress has established the federal agencies, and he turns his attention to what he sees as the really second order of business, which is a Bill of Rights. And he remembers that this really was what the anti-federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, had demanded as the price of ratification. And so when he moves to, let's tackle a Bill of Rights next, some of the supporters of the Constitution, that is, some of the Federalists, really don't like the idea because they hadn't really thought it was necessary to begin with. They had objected to begin with. Also, some of the anti-federalists, one, Elbridge Gerry, for example. And Elbridge Gerry is someone you could spend the rest of your life trying to figure out why he takes one position at any given time, because he does change his positions a lot, which, you know, might make him someone who thinks for himself, or some of you might call him a flip-flopper on things. But Gerry also says, no, we really shouldn't take this up now. There is some idea among the opponents that maybe we still can get a second convention. So not having a Bill of Rights might be one way to do this. Or maybe they accepted the argument the Federalists were making, that this is a government of limited powers. Any power not given is reserved. Madison, on the other hand, has come to see that there is a need for a Bill of Rights, even though he really didn't like the idea of parchment barriers being such a great thing. He saw, as Jefferson had said, that a Bill of Rights will give people who are aggrieved leverage in court. So what Madison does is takes all of the proposals that had been sent in by the state ratifying conventions, as well as looking at all of the state bills of rights. And from this, he comes up with a list of about 140 or so different rights that are protected either in state constitutions or were proposed by the anti-federalists. And from this, he creates 12 proposed amendments to the Constitution. Now, at this time, there is no calling this a Bill of Rights. They don't say, hey, let's draw up a Bill of Rights. Instead, they are called the Articles of Amendment, or the amendments to the Constitution. And the first one, anyone know what the first amendment Madison proposed said? See, I think you're on to me and my shallow pedagogical tricks where I ask you a question like that, and someone's immediately going to say, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. And I would say, no, that's not the first one he proposed. The first one he proposed was on the size of Congress, how big it should be, because this was actually a grievance that people had. Congress was going to be too small. That is, one representative for every 30,000 people, when in Massachusetts, there's one representative for every 100 people in the state legislature. You know, so you have one representative. So Massachusetts's legislature has about 300 members. whereas the Congress of the entire United States is going to have 100 members. How can that really be representative? So Madison's First Amendment calls for increasing the size of Congress as the country grows. So ultimately, there would be up to about 300 members of the House of Representatives. The second one also deals with Congress because there was a fear that people will get into Congress and raise their own pay. That is, Congress has control of its own salaries, and what's going to stop these guys from jacking up their pay? So the second amendment that Madison proposed says that no law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. So Congress can raise the pay of Congress, but the pay raise doesn't take effect until there has been another election. So we can't say, hey, let's raise our own pay. No, we can raise our pay, and then if people don't like it, they can vote us out, but the people who were voted in get the pay raise. So that's the second one Madison proposed. And then the third is the one I just mentioned, which we think of as the first. So there are 12 amendments, and Madison drafts them, Madison submits them to Congress, and Congress then debates them. We can talk more about the debate over these articles of amendment probably next time, but let me also just say that second one that Madison proposed and the first one he proposed were both rejected by the states in 1788, 89, and 1790. So they weren't ratified. However, if you go to the Massachusetts archives, for example, and they have a parchment copy of these articles of amendment on display because they were sent to the state for ratification, and Massachusetts is one of the states that did not ratify them. The Senate agreed to some, the House agreed to others, but they couldn't agree on which ones. And so Massachusetts didn't ratify the articles of amendment until 1939, when they thought it would be a good idea. Massachusetts and Georgia, which had rejected them initially, approved them 150 years later. But then in the 1980s, Congress started raising its own pay, which is something that does actually irritate people. Whatever justification there is for paying these worthies more, some folks don't like it when people raise their own pay, particularly people who are paid by the public. And so someone went to the National Archives or one of these state archives and read the original articles of amendment and said, well, wait a minute, back in 1789, James Madison had proposed something very similar to solving this problem we now see. And so states in the 1980s began ratifying that amendment, which had not been ratified in 1789. So if you look at your text of the Constitution, you will see that that is actually the 26th Amendment ratified in 1992. Of course, Congress objected. Congress said, no, that's out of date. You can't ratify it now. But it was in fact, both James Madison and the Anti-Federalists' revenge on a runaway Congress of the 1980s and 1990s. So we'll get back to this next time, our discussion of the Bill of Rights, and then talk about what Congress does in getting down to solving the serious problems of the country in the 1790s. And it gives us hope, I think, that Congress might conceivably be able to solve serious problems that a country has. But Congress also is going to do things like decide where the president should sit and what we should call him, and other issues which are more entertaining, I think, than useful to the public weal. Anyway, I will see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Good to see you.
Professor?
Yes, Ahmed.